Welcome to the Leadership School podcast. I'm your host, leadership and self-care coach, Kyla Kofer. Here at the Leadership School, you'll hear leaders from around the world sharing their stories and expertise on how to lead with balance and integrity. Our goal? Teach you how to be an extraordinary leader. Welcome back, leaders. I'm really excited to continue our college tour today. Today, we're talking with Dr. Corbette Doyle from Vanderbilt University. She tells us about the courses that she's teaching on inclusive leadership and gives us a really incredible lesson on what is diversity, what is inclusion, and why does this even matter to a company, to an organization, to you? Why should it matter? How does it impact you? What does it look like to lead an inclusive organization? It's a fascinating conversation full of research-based methods. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Corbette Doyle. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Corbette Doyle. I really appreciate you joining me on this podcast. I'm really excited. So I'm going to actually just let you start and tell me what campus you're from, and we'll just the conversation will flow. So maybe you could just tell us all about you.
So, Corbette Doyle, I am a professor at Vanderbilt University. I teach within Peabody, which is the College of Education and Human Development. And I would emphasize the human development part because there are so many interesting and relevant programs within Peabody, relevant to this podcast, within Peabody that people might not expect. And that would include me. So I actually, my master's degree is from Vanderbilt's Business School. And when I decided to pursue my doctorate, and the dean of the business school said, I wanted to get it at Vanderbilt. And he's like, well, have you ever considered doing a joint doctorate between, the business school and Peabody? I'm like, why would I get a doctorate at the College of Education? And so he's the one who first filled me in on how rich the programs are at Vanderbilt. And so as a result of meetings with the business school dean, I ended up meeting with some people at Peabody, and they ended up offering me a faculty position. And one of the first courses I taught my very first semester was leadership. And that was before I got my doctorate. So I ended up working on my doctorate in organizational leadership at Northeastern University while I was teaching at Vanderbilt.
Oh, wow. So interesting. Okay. So you didn't end up finishing your doctorate at Vanderbilt?
No, I didn't even start a doctoral program at Vanderbilt because I had a very rich and robust corporate career before deciding that I was going to return to much earlier aspirations and get my doctorate. And so I ended up joining the faculty, and then 3 years later saying, no, I still really want my doctorate. So I pursued it anyway.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that just led me two separate directions. So we're going to try and do the one that comes first and then follow up. So I want to hear all about Vanderbilt, and I have a lot of questions about Vanderbilt that you brought up just now, but you said your rich corporate career. So will you tell us about that a little bit and your experience there?
Yes. So I had a very long career in the corporate risk and insurance and consulting industry. And, the last 15 years, I commuted from Nashville to Chicago every week. So for 2 days a week. And the company I worked for, Aon, actually hired me I started when I was 7 months pregnant, and with my second, and earned over 5 million frequent flyer miles while I still had a corporate career. Spent most of my career in both the analytics space and running the healthcare industry practice, and then was asked to take on the role as the global head of diversity, the inaugural global head of diversity. So.
Well, what caused you to be asked to take that on? Like, what were you doing that people are like, this person needs to be doing this? Oh, okay. Tell us about this.
So I became very interested in the diversity and inclusion space when, as an executive, I was asked to attend the firm's first executive diversity training session. And so I attended, and there were 6 of us, and I was the only woman. And
So it was a very diverse group of people.
It was a very diverse group, right. Except for the woman who was leading it, who was a new hire. It was someone who had just been hired. And, the gentlemen, I knew all the gentlemen in the room. They were all fabulous. And, and the woman who's doing the training is going on and on about, why we have to care about diversity and why it's important. And the men in the room were like, yeah, I get it, but tell us how to solve it. And she had no answers. And I'm like, this is a problem.
Sure. Yeah.
This is a problem because people need solutions. They need to understand what to do to address the issue, not just this stuff that is really causing so much pushback across the globe, but particularly in the US, because so many organizations are doing now what the company I worked for was doing in, this was 2003 when I first became really interested in the topic, 2003, 2004. And, we're still doing it. We're still doing this training that accomplishes nothing except somebody can,
change
market
forever, doesn't it? So you started to really push back against that and to start actually giving and finding.
And it wasn't so much pushing back, but I actually ended up doing research with a friend of mine. We said, look, we have, because we both had robust corporate careers, but we said, and most of our friends had careers, but we knew a lot of women who were saying, this doesn't work. The payoff, the trade-off does not work. I have children, I have childcare expenses, I'm not getting paid enough, I'm not advancing in my career. And so, the women we knew were not staying home, but they were becoming solopreneurs long before it was as popular as it is today. And right. Yes. There we go.
I just pointed at myself. Like that's why I'm here. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's yes. And so my focus was, look, we have to solve this. We have to make this more attractive. We can't afford to train a huge chunk of our workforce and have them take the elevator to the exit. And so that was my focus, and I kept pushing.
Wow. So that just interest kept growing and led you into getting further education degrees.
So not quite. So what really happened was I was approached to take on this chief diversity role. And I'm like, I didn't want to do it. And I said, I think I can have a bigger impact as a leader with P&L responsibility, where I can hire people, I can promote people. But I was convinced to do it. And I tell people who are interested in the field this all the time. It was simultaneously the best and worst job I've ever had. And so
interesting.
And it was the best because of the potential to have an impact, the people that I was working with. But it is a role that rarely has authority. You look for people with influence, but it's not a role with authority. And, and I see this in higher ed all the time. The people who are in those roles are not the ones who are impact players. They're not the ones who make the decisions about who gets hired, who gets promoted, who gets
So is that role like just a formality, or like how do we actually create these roles so that people can make decisions?
So my opinion, the way it should be handled, and it's not the way many organizations handle it, but it is the way some do. I think that role, much like people in the human resource function, should be subject matter experts. We can't look to people in our HR department to be the ones who improve employee experience for the workforce because they have a small workforce. They are subject matter experts and can help other managers and leaders be more effective at it. Same thing with equity, diversity, and inclusion. Subject matter experts can help your leaders understand where the disconnects are, understand the opportunities to be more inclusive leaders, to be more effective leaders, but they can't do the work for them. And so, if you have the right leadership team and you have a voice, you can have influence, but you still are not a decision maker.
Is it an advisory role? Is it like an advisory role? Mm-hmm. So trying to create systems and processes, but then other people making those decisions to actually have to implement them and do them.
Correct.
That's really challenging.
It's very challenging. And it's more challenging than ever for a host of reasons. And I'm not going to go into all of them right now, but it's been challenging for many different reasons. But one of them is that in too many cases, we have not done it well. We have not taken an evidence-based approach in too many organizations to, what are the things we know? What are the things we need to know? And what are the things we can do to have an impact? And
the action.
Yes, but again, evidence-based. We know that a lot of diversity training does not work. The research is very clear, but people are still doing it. They're still hiring people who are doing really ineffective training that gets people's hackles up, makes people angry, makes people feel left out. So,
well, I've been really surprised to hear that some people don't even understand what that word diversity means. I know of a company here in town that does sensitivity training, and that's their training. And when I mentioned diversity or DEI, they just kind of stared at me and they said, well, what is that? Why would we do that? And their sensitivity training is just something that people go to and make fun of. It's not actually effective. So what does this look like to start? I mean, I'm seeing it growing, seeing more education around it and people making more of an invested effort into it. But what does that really mean to be a diverse organization?
So, there's two things I would like to respond to that you mentioned. Yeah. One is how should organizations approach it? And the second is what does it mean to be a diverse organization? So let me take that second one first. So when you mentioned the conversation with someone at another organization and they were not familiar, with the term diversity, I would tell you that it is one of my pet peeves. And it is the way people use the word diversity. And so, we need to bring a diverse candidate in. And well, what does that mean? Because diverse is a comparative term. I mean, every individual has multiple identities. And so if you want to get into individual identities and the fact that we have an array of identities, maybe. But the correct way to use the term is to think of a group that represents lots of different identities rather than a singular dominant identity with little variation in the group. So a diverse group is going to have variation.
So you're not talking about just like a particular culture. You're talking about people or a way of thought, not just even culture, but that we all think the same and we all act alike no matter what we look like, but having differences in the way we think and approach problems too.
Yes, and so it's cognitive diversity is a very important component of diversity. And if people haven't figured that out with all the friction we have around the world, it's not just our country, it's around the world. If you haven't figured out that cognitive diversity is a problem or a source of problems, everyone should understand it by now. We wouldn't have wars we wouldn't have wars within a country if cognitive diversity wasn't an issue. But there are some people, when they are attempting to help people understand the notion of diversity, will use this wheel. There's the inside circle is all the things no one else can see about us. And there's lots of different things that we might identify within that. And then the next wheel are the things we can see about people that are differences. And then the outer wheel is all the things who formed who we are, our education, our geography, what was happening in the world, our socioeconomic status. So those are things you don't see, but they certainly informed who we are, how we think, and how we approach things. So and each one of those circles has lots of different components. So it is important to understand that those all represent different dimensions of diversity. But when the word is used correctly in an organizational setting, we aren't saying, we need to go hire someone who has a different skin color or a different gender or a different level of physical ability so that we can say we have diversity. That individual is not diverse. The individual is maybe different from the other individuals in the work group. So you then have a group that has diversity, but it's not that the individual is your diversity.
So being careful, that's like the token person of color on the team, like that's the diverse. We brought somebody in and they're diverse, No, it's saying like as a group, we are diverse. So that can be, I feel like sometimes you could use that as an excuse. You could say, well, we all think differently, or this person's 10 years older than me. So we could say that we have diversity in our group without actually really making an intentional effort towards being including differences.
Absolutely. And that is not what I'm suggesting. No. So I was really just jumping on the use of the word.
Yeah,
and
I'm glad you did.
Because it has become a curse word of sorts. One of the reasons that is rising to the forefront is that, economic times are getting more difficult. And so fear is rising across the board. And whenever economic insecurity increases, when jobs, the threat of losing one's job rise, you tend to see more tension in any workplace. Because some organizations have, taken approaches that increase the likelihood that individuals who represent the majority in a workforce feel like they no longer have an equal opportunity for promotions, for training, to even get a job. And I'm not saying that's the case. I said feel, because of approaches some organizations have taken. You increase the pushback. You make it so much harder for organizations that are working to create an inclusive environment where everyone has a comparable opportunity to get hired, to feel like they're part of the team, to get promoted, to earn a compensation that is commensurate with the work they're doing. That's an inclusive environment, where people feel like they are able to have a unique identity and still feel like they're part of the group. And so when we implement strategies or behave in a way that makes some people feel like that's not the case, we don't have inclusion. And we need to remember that people in the majority can feel left out as well. So it's not that we do not need corrective action in organizations to be equitable in our decision-making processes, but our goal should not be, got to push this group aside because they've had more than their fair share. We got to focus on this group now, and they can wait their, next go round. A rising sea lifts all boats. That's the approach that inclusive organizations take.
So I love that we switched over to kind of talking about inclusivity. And this is the course that you teach at Vanderbilt, right?
It is. Mm-hmm.
Tell me the name of the course.
So leading inclusive organizations.
So was that always the title of your course?
No, the title was, the first go round, it was leading diverse organizations. And I filled out the paperwork to change the title of the course. I think inclusive organizations needs to be the focus across the board.
So like being intentional about the difference of what we're creating and what we're talking about, and what we're attempting to do. So tell us a little bit about that course and what you're teaching there, because all of your experience has led up to this, right? So all of that corporate experience of being at that level, not feeling like you actually got to make the decisions, not getting the opportunity to really make those decisions, but being that a more advisory role, but seeing all those things that needed to change. I know that you're bringing all of that into your course. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. What are we doing in this course?
All right. So I should mention, I have not mentioned, but I have an analytical approach to most things that I do. And, my undergraduate degrees were, economics, math minor, and then MBA program. And I like evidence and I like data. And so my approach is through an organizational lens rather than an individual lens. It is not a psychology-driven approach. It has components of sociology, but it is much more an organizational strategy lens. And so I focus on what do we know from the literature and what do we still need to know from the literature. And so, students take a robust dive into the research that is being done to help us understand, what is happening in organizations and, what works and what doesn't work. From my perspective as an academic, one of the things that's so exciting is that there is so much more research being published in this space every year than in prior years. And there are multiple theories about why that might be the case, but there is something called publication bias, and that is that, this is a hot topic. People are actually going to read the journals, and so articles start getting published that would not have been published before. And so that may well be the case. I mean, some of the researchers who have some of really strong names in this space, like Quinetta Roberson, who's done some really wonderful work in this space, I'm guessing that she didn't have quite the receptivity to her research early in her career as she does now, but I don't know that for a fact. But there is a lot of research out there, and most of the research, provides really useful insight, and in many cases points out all of the holes in terms of what we know. And every organization is different. So you're focusing on leadership, and leadership is if the head of an organization comes into an existing organization, they can't immediately craft the culture of that organization. Sometimes they will never be able to craft the culture of that organization.
Change takes so long sometimes. It just takes
so
a long time. And we can look at like our country and the history of our country. You can look at civil rights movement. I mean, that should have happened way before the 60s, but here it is happening. And then here we are, how many years later? 60 years later. And did I do that math right? 60 years later, and still struggling and still wandering, muddling through these topics. And we're going, this is insane. Like, this should have been something that we had already worked through. But change does take time, because especially when you have millions of people, that you're having to like change and shift a whole culture of a way of thinking. So I think the research is really, really important, because the data and numbers can show us how things have changed, how we still have to go, and what's actually happening. But it's really exciting to me that more things are getting published about it, because I'm thinking, man, we should have had these things 50 years ago. I feel like it's kind of like a snowball. I'm wondering, I mean, maybe you can talk about that a little bit, but it's sometimes it feels like big change like this is like that little tiny snowball that just is down a really slow rolling hill. It just has to grow and grow and grow, and before it can actually make an impact.
I think that there's a lot of truth to that. And of course, if a heat wave comes along, it'll melt that snowball. Right. And so that stops the progress in its tracks. And so I do think the research can help us, but I think that the research we really need, and the people who are the top researchers in this space say this in their articles, we need better partnerships between practitioners and researchers, so that what's happening in practice, inside organizations, happens at a much faster rate than what happens with research, because there's such a long delay between the time you collect the data.
Well, that's kind of what you were talking about at the beginning, right? When you were saying, having that role in your corporate position, having that executive role, but then needing to have the partnerships with the leaders who are actually going to be implementing that. How do we bridge that? What does that actually look like if we're struggling so much, and like, here's the theory, here's the practice, like, how do we make that connection? So I started this podcast because I wanted to learn and grow in my leadership journey. And I have been so incredibly inspired by the guests and the conversations. And especially recently with this college tour, I've really learned so much. So once the interview ends, I actually keep the conversation going, because I have found that sometimes the richest part of the conversation is when we feel like the interview's over and we can just kind of have a relaxed, more casual conversation. Also, if you've noticed, if you've been following this podcast for some time, I used to ask every guest 2 questions. What does integrity mean to them? And what does balance look like to them? Well, I haven't stopped asking those questions. We're just putting those over on our Patreon page. So go check it out at patreon.com/leadership school. And for $6.50 a month, you can support this podcast. It takes a lot to produce every single episode, and honestly, I could use a little bit of support. So anything that you're able to contribute would really mean a lot to me and would able to help me to continue to bring these high caliber guests in to have conversations on what does it look like to be an extraordinary leader and how do we practically do that. So those conversations are continuing over at patreon.com/leadership school, where I'm asking guests some extra questions, some bonus questions, and you'll get some bonus content over there. So be sure to go check it out. Thanks so much for your support. And thanks so much for subscribing, listening, and sharing this podcast. It really does mean a lot. And I'm so honored to show up here in your podcast feed.
So I will give you an example of the organization that I hold out as my best practice, and all the leaders have changed, but it's Sodexo, which is a French-based company. It's a global company, food service. They service a lot of the airports. They service a lot of colleges, a huge company. And Dr. Rohini Anand was their long-term global head of diversity. And she and the CEO had an unbelievable partnership, and they did a lot of research. They have a massive workforce, and they studied what was happening using evidence-based approaches. They studied what was happening in their workforce. They determined what were best practices in their organization, and they implemented them. And they I'm hard pressed to identify an organization that has been so successful at doing that. And, they partnered with outside researchers as well, but they did a lot of really impressive research themselves.
Do you think that's because they were intentional about it? So they were intentional and they did the research. And then when they got results from the research, they took action and they took steps to actually implement things instead of going, oh, that's good research. Good to know.
Correct.
Wow.
It was, they developed practice-based evidence and used that the same way they would for any other aspect of their business to convince their leaders of why it made sense. I mean, they were showing tremendous strategic and financial results from the focus on diversity and inclusion.
So if you were to recommend someone who is a solopreneur, small business owner, or student, someone who's learning, who wants to go forward with creating more inclusion in their workplaces, but doesn't have the ability to do massive amounts of research, what would you recommend they do?
So I think it would be very difficult for small businesses and solopreneurs to. I mean, if it was a solopreneur who was in the consulting space and trying to help organizations, then you should partner. And there are different ways to partner. You can partner with other organizations doing the same thing that are larger and have a virtual partnership. You can partner with universities that have classes and maybe bring some interns on board who can help you identify the research. I know, at Vanderbilt in many of our classes, particularly the master's level classes, we partner with organizations all the time on what we call micro internships, where, students in a class will do a project for an organization and, do the research, search for the evidence and develop a strategy. And so in my inclusion class, when I teach it, that's what students are doing. They're working on real projects, and the focus is organizational strategy. It's what are the issues? What is a viable goal to focus on? Viable means realistic in the period of time that you are targeting to achieve the goal, just like a financial plan, right? Many of us have been stuck with financial goals that are absolutely unattainable, and that's self-defeating. But then you work backwards and you say, okay, if that's the goal, what's the last thing right before achieving that goal that we have to have accomplished? And what do we have to have accomplished right before that? So you do this backwards design to come up with a realistic plan that is supported by the evidence and factors in the internal and external hurdles. So what are the people hurdles that you're going to have to encounter? What's happening in the outside world that you have to factor in? So, that's the approach I take in classes. And so when students are working on projects, that's the approach when I teach a class that they are taking with the organizations that they work with to help them improve what they're doing.
That's amazing. And just really powerful, and what a great opportunity. You mentioned it briefly earlier, but all this work to be an inclusive organization, to bring in diversity. And when I say bring in diversity, I'm meaning like what you mentioned, not like bringing that diverse person in, but making our group diverse, being equitable. Why does it matter to businesses? They're focused on trying to, make money, make the sale, grow as a business. I say it matters because I think it's the right thing to do. But I think if we're going to talk a little bit more like what matters to companies financially or big picture for a company, why would this matter for a company to be so intentional about being an inclusive organization?
All right. So I'm going to address three things. And the first one is I don't want to completely ignore the quasi-facetious point you made, because it relates to the earlier question you asked me about, small businesses. The opportunity that a small business has, forget this ability to partner with researchers and hire experts, because small businesses can't do that. But small businesses have the best opportunity to build an inclusive culture from the start. And, Southwest's early days are one of the best examples. They were so careful about who they hired. And the way you build a culture in an organization is that you are very intentional about who you hire. You are very intentional about the behaviors that you reward. And you are very intentional about the behaviors you punish. And so you would not have situations like Matt Lauer or some of the stories, in Hollywood about bad actors who were rainmakers, who were allowed to be bad actors because they were rainmakers. When you build an intentional culture from the beginning, you punish those behaviors rather than tolerate them, and you reward a different set of behaviors. And that's how you build a culture. So small businesses, you want to have an impact. Be intentional from day one. You might have to look a little harder to hire the people that are going to help you build that culture, but you're going to have a far more successful organization if you do. The other two reasons, and one, and it is the dominant reason that it is currently the most compelling reason for convincing organizations to be more inclusive. And that is a lot of the consulting firms in particular are generating early research amidst this great resignation, great reimagination, whatever you want to call it. But employees are disengaged. Employees do not want to come back to the workplace. Leaders of large organizations want them to come back for jobs that are thinking jobs, cognitive focused rather than physically focused, where you need to be in a specific workplace to do physical work. Employees in those roles have lots of choices. And the evidence would suggest that happy employees are engaged employees. They are far more likely to say in surveys that they work in an inclusive environment, far more likely, like 300%. I can't remember the statistic at the moment,
That's
but
huge.
It's massive. It's massive. And they are far more likely to say they give their all at work. So, the quiet quitting, that's the other thing. So I'm hard pressed to come up with, for most organizations right now, a more compelling reason that then all employees feel better working in an environment where they feel like they can be themselves, and people are going to give them the benefit of the doubt if they say something. People aren't going to be chopping their head, oh, you shouldn't have said that, or how could you say that? Or that's such a stupid idea. You're going to have the benefit of the doubt. Well, tell me more about that. Why are you saying that? And so those behaviors attract people to the team they're on. They attract people to the others that they work with, and they attract them to the organization.
And then that just carries out. So once you have those people in the right places, that's when you can gain success in your company, because they're excited, they're showing up, you're retaining them, you're not having to hire someone new and replace them, but they are like putting effort into the company, which is what you want them to do, because they want to be there.
They want to be there. And I'm not saying that salary doesn't matter, but again, the surveys that are coming out of the consulting firms, McKinsey, BCG, Gartner Group, over and over again showing that we know this. We've known this for decades. Salary is not a motivator. Salary is a threshold. You've got to meet the threshold. But you don't motivate maybe top salespeople because there's a lot of evidence that some of the top salespeople are ones who are motivated by measures of success. It's the measures of success. And so that could be money.
Well, and now when we're talking about, we've got so much, another pandemic with burnout. So burnout being a huge issue. Yes, the Great Resignation, you mentioned that, but people are leaving places because their well-being matters to them. I mean, look at Arianna Huffington Thrive Global, a whole organization created for reducing burnout in the workplace. So if we're paying attention to this, I love Arianna Huffington's the way she describes it as a third metric of success. If we're paying attention to this third metric of success, our well-being, then the salary doesn't matter. And that's when this needs to be important at the organization.
And she's been talking about that and sleep for over 10 years. So.
And it's still relevant. Right. I'm a huge fan.
So just picking up on one of the other points that you started to make, just in terms of the virtuous cycle, which is what I would call this notion of, when your employees actually like the organization, they like the people they work with, they want, to be a part of that group, they're bringing their A game to work. One of the other impacts of that virtuous cycle is innovation. So again, very strong evidence that suggests that the most innovative organizations are inclusive organizations. And it makes sense, because if inclusion means I can express an idea that people might not like and people will give me the benefit of the doubt, that's where some of the best ideas come from. How are you going to be innovative if all you're suggesting is something that everybody agrees to because we already knew about it? And that's not going to get you there.
I've left organizations for that reason, because I felt like every time I spoke up, people just stared at me like, oh, there she goes again with another idea. And I was like, I'm done. I can't be the only one showing up and disagreeing here.
Right.
Well, let's transition just for a few minutes. I want to hear a little bit more about Vanderbilt, because you mentioned Peabody College, which I've heard this about Vanderbilt before, and I actually used to work at Vanderbilt like years and years and years ago. But this is something a little bit different that I don't hear about on a lot of other campuses, that the university is separated into colleges.
Oh, that is true at most universities.
Is it?
But if it's a small university, you might not actually see it.
That must be it. Because I went to university, but I just never really noticed that we were different colleges. Like that's something I think about, like at Oxford, you've got like your different specific colleges, but.
And that is, I was on the board of trust of a college that was a private college and is now part of the UT system. And we had multiple debates on the board about changing the name to college or university. And I was firmly in the camp that universities are multiple colleges. It's a college if it is one school. And if you have multiple colleges within the entity, then it's a university. And so that is what you will see in most of the major.
Well, that makes so much sense. I just don't know if I ever really thought about it that way, but it's very significant at Vanderbilt. Like it's that Peabody is its own separate college. So what makes Peabody different from Owen?
So multiple things. First of all, until I think 4 years ago, Owen was a graduate school only.
Okay.
And no undergraduate. It currently does not have any enrolled undergraduate students, but it does have a minor in business. And so there are undergraduate students who take classes at Owen, but they are not Owen students.
Okay.
So Vanderbilt does not have an undergraduate business degree. You cannot major in business as an undergraduate at Vanderbilt, and you have never been able to.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yes. And so in the early 90s, one of my colleagues who recently retired, very entrepreneurial, it was when the whole field of organizational development was really it was still in its infancy. And he's like, Peabody's official name is the College of Education and Human Development. And he's like, human development, human and organizational development. And so he got approval to launch a new major, human and organizational development, known on campus as HOD. and it is the largest undergraduate major at Vanderbilt. And the focus from the beginning was on leadership. It was on organizational theory and organizational development. It was on teams, systematic inquiry. So an array of courses, and there are 5 different tracks. And so you can, when you get to your upper division classes, you can focus on community development. You can focus on organizational leadership. So there are 5 different tracks that you can choose. Organizational leadership is the largest of the tracks. And it is, a lot of our students minor in business now, or they minor or major in economics if they're interested in pursuing a traditional business career, which, the majority do. But we have a focus at Peabody on what Aaron Hurst, an entrepreneur and philanthropist, coined as human skills, not soft skills, but human skills. And our students are highly sought after. They bring what many organizations say are the skills most needed in the workplace right now. So ability to deal with ambiguity, critical thinking, collaboration skills, the ability to work effectively on teams, presentation skills. So they're really amazing. And so we have degrees that have spun out of that at the master's level. And so leadership and organizational performance, which is where my inclusion class, first started. And now we have a doctoral program, leading and learning organizations. And so they've all really spun out of that original nucleus of HOD.
So HOD started out as an undergraduate program.
And it still is. HOD itself is undergrad.
That's the undergraduate program. And then you can move on to the upper levels of the master's and the doctoral program. Tell me the names of those programs again, the master's and the doctorate level.
Well, and we have multiple master's programs, but the one that I teach in is leadership and organizational performance. And it sits in a department that's called leadership policy and organizations. And so it's broader. We have multiple master's and doctoral programs within that umbrella. Leadership being, just for relevance, leadership being the dominant theme that connects all of those master's programs. And so we have master's programs in international education and policy. We have a master's in public policy. We have a master's in higher ed administration. So we have a master's in independent school leadership. And then we have the, leadership and organizational performance.
Wow. How many students are in your master's?
Collectively?
Yeah. How big is Vanderbilt as far as student numbers?
Vanderbilt as a whole is a little under 13,000 students, and it's close to 50-50 undergraduate and graduate students generally, which would be master's through doctoral programs. And doctoral programs would include, a JD, a law degree, that is a doctoral degree. An MD is a doctoral degree. They are both practical degrees. An EDD in the College of Education is a practical, doctoral degree in education. And then, of course, we have our PhD program. So we have a very robust PhD program with many PhD students in leadership.
So what do you go do with a doctorate in leadership, and specifically the one that you guys are doing? I cannot remember the name of it, even though you told me 3 times.
So we actually have, we have on-campus doctoral degrees, both PhDs and EDDs. And the one we had talked about was our incredibly successful online EDD in leading and learning organizations. So it has been ranked by multiple sources as the number one, online doctoral program. The students are amazing. I'm teaching one of the courses I teach in that program this semester. And, they're just amazing people. Many of them come from education, and because they find it because it's Peabody and LPO, the department that I sit within, Leadership, Policy, and Organizations, is top ranked. That department is consistently number one, in the rankings. And People who are in education are looking to become principals, school superintendents. Some want to move into the policy realm because we have a heavy focus on policy in our department. So even at the master's level, we attract a lot of people who've been educators and understand that the opportunity for systemic change lies within policy. And so we have, my policy focused colleagues are just doing amazing research. So many go that route. Some want to start charter schools. So we've had many who work in charter schools or who want to launch their own charter schools and have successfully done that. Many are in higher ed and have been very successful moving up the ranks in terms of leadership roles in higher ed. And then about a third of the students are from consulting. They're in human resources, entrepreneurs, military. We've had generals in the program, so an array. One of my former students who did such unbelievable work in crisis management, which at the time was volunteer role, is now leading. She's a director of a program for veteran resiliency. And just because of the work she did in the program, she did all of her classes. She focused them all around this research on crisis intervention. And so they're amazing, but they're incredibly diverse in terms of the fields they pursue and the interests they pursue.
And this is how you use the word diverse. Our whole lesson comes to a beautiful conclusion. I love that. That's so great. Well, it sounds like there's some really exciting things happening at Vanderbilt on campus, including absolutely the course that you're teaching. And I'm intrigued by it. And I've just learned so much through this conversation. I'm just really grateful. Is there anything else that you really want to make sure comes across to anybody who's listening?
First, I love education. It's why I keep pursued additional degrees, and I am fascinated by the research. And I would encourage everyone to embrace lifelong learning. The world is changing so rapidly. I listened to a podcast. It was a LinkedIn, not a podcast. It was a LinkedIn Learning, video interview on the implications of ChatGPT for business. And so I listened to that today. And I've been following a lot and using ChatGPT, but I did not appreciate just how massive the implications are. And there's whole new careers. Like there's actually a whole marketplace for people who are solopreneurs and are experts at crafting prompts for AI. So it's PromptBase is the name of the online marketplace for a new field already.
Wow.
And so you don't have to go back to school to be a lifelong learner. But if you are not focused on ways for yourself, and if you're in a leadership role for the people that you are leading to foster lifelong learning, you're doing yourself a disservice and you're doing a disservice to the people you lead.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great way to wrap up and end. And thank you so much for this incredible, it was like an experience. It wasn't just a conversation. I just feel like I've really experienced something. I just really learned a lot from this conversation. And I'm really grateful. And I think it's just a really valuable topic. And I think the work that you're doing is just amazing. And so thanks for sharing it with us and for continuing to, what I just really love is when people step into the things that give them so much life and joy. And I see that you're doing that in education and that just radiates out to everybody else who gets the opportunity to learn from you. So thank you very much.
Well, and thank you for the work that you're doing. I am a podcastaholic and I love listening. And I know not everyone feels like they're an audio learner. I am definitely an audio learner. So I appreciate you adding to my lifelong learning efforts.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Hey, thank you so much for listening. If you've liked what you heard and you want some more tools and resources to help you on your journey, go check out kylakofer.com/free stuff.